The jig is one of the best bass lures that you could throw during the winter time, and it can produce some good quality fish this time of year. If you could brave the cold temperatures this time of year, you could potentially get that one bite that many bass anglers only dream about. For many different reasons, many anglers do not have confidence throwing a jig and are making very common mistakes whenever they're fishing a jig during the winter time. In today's video, I will be going over 5 common jig mistakes that I see many anglers make, and by avoiding these 5 common mistakes, you will get more bites on the jig during the winter time. Let me know down below if you agree or disagree with my 5 winter jig fishing mistakes in the comment section down below. Also, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. The channel has been receiving so much positive feedback recently, and I really do appreciate all the continued support for the channel. It really does mean so much to me. The first mistake I'm going to talk about today is using a jig trailer with too much action during the winter time. I see many anglers make this mistake with the jig during the winter time, and this is one of the main reasons why they do not get as many bites or any at all during the winter. This is a very common mistake often overlooked by many anglers, and it can severely impact how many bass that you catch on the jig when the water temperature drops. This time of year, it is absolutely crucial that your jig trailer does not have much action so you can get more bites during the winter time. This is because when the water temperature drops, the forage will not move around as quickly and are very lethargic this time of year. The forage will not move quickly because they want to save as much energy as possible compared to the warmer months whenever they'll be moving around a lot more frequently. If you are using a trailer with too much action, you will not imitate the forage very well and you will not get that many bites. The 2 trailers that I really like to use this time of year is the Gary Yamamoto Hula Grub and the Gary Yamamoto Double Tail Grub. These 2 jig trailers work extremely well this time of year and have a more natural action whenever they're moved throughout the water column. I've done really well using these as jig trailers throughout the whole entire year, and I have caught some good quality bass using them. However, it's really important for you to experiment and see what works best for you and the body of water that you are fishing. These 2 trailers will be a good starting point if you're new to fishing a jig during the winter time, and you will get a lot more bites using these on the back of your jigs. Make sure you comment down below what your favorite wintertime jig trailer is. The second mistake that I see many anglers make whenever they're fishing a jig during the wintertime is fishing it the same exact way. Many bass fishermen will hop the jig across the bottom trying to entice a bass into biting. Don't get me wrong, this retrieve will catch bass this time of year. However, there's so many different retrieves that you can use whenever you're fishing a jig during the wintertime. The first retrieve that I'm going to talk about is slowly dragging your jig across the bottom instead of hopping it up and letting it fall back down. By dragging the jig across the bottom, you will maintain a lot more bottom contact compared to if you're hopping it up and letting it fall back down. This retrieve can work really well during the wintertime, especially whenever the bass are very lethargic. However, it really does depend on what type of cover that you are fishing the jig around this time of year. My favorite time to drag the jig across the bottom is whenever I'm fishing it around rocks. This has worked really well for me, and it drives the bass absolutely crazy whenever they see the jig getting dragged across the bottom. Whenever you are fishing the jig around rocks, make sure you try this retrieve out. Another retrieve that works really well this time of year is dead sticking your jig and letting it sit there for a while, and then after some time, slowly moving your jig just a little bit and then just letting it sit there some more. Sometimes whenever the water temperature is very low, this retrieve can work really well, especially when the bass are not wanting to bite any other retrieve. By just letting the jig sit there, you will drive the bass absolutely crazy, and it will look very realistic to the forage that you are imitating this time of year. You can pause the jig for however long you want, but generally this time of year whenever the water temperature drops, I will generally let it sit there for about 20 seconds or so. But you can let it sit there for even longer, but personally I like to cover at least a decent amount of water this time of year, So 20 seconds is kind of my sweet spot. It really depends on the mood for the bass for that day, so make sure you experiment to see how long the bass want the jig to sit there for. By fishing the jig with different retrieves, you will catch a lot more fish during the wintertime and you will be more productive with the jig. Make sure you comment down below what your favorite retrieve is whenever you're fishing the jig during the wintertime. The third mistake that I see many anglers make whenever they are fishing a jig during the wintertime is not using the right size jig jig weight for the right situation. This is a very common mistake that many anglers make whenever they are fishing a jig this time of year. To decide what jig weight you should use, it is important to consider the behavior of the bass during the winter. This time of year, bass will generally relate more to deeper water and will be hugging the bottom more often than not. Whenever I'm fishing a jig during the winter time, I will generally use a 1/2 ounce jig whenever they are relating to deeper water. This is because it is a larger profile compared to a smaller jig, and the bass will be more willing to eat a big and easy meal compared to eating just a smaller one. This will trigger a reaction strike out of the bass, and you will better imitate the forage in the body of water that you are fishing. Sometimes it's better to use a heavier jig than a 1/2 ounce jig, especially if you're trying to go for a larger profile. This is a good way to target some huge bass during the winter, and you can potentially catch your next personal best bass fishing a bigger profile jig. Bass will not feed as often this time of year, so using a larger profile jig will imitate a much larger meal. By imitating a larger size meal, the bass will think it's quick and easy, and they will not be able to resist biting your jig. A good way to think about jig size is whenever you're throwing a larger size jig, you will weed through much of the smaller fish compared to if you're using a smaller jig, you'll probably catch some of those smaller fish more often than not. Another reason why you should fish a larger size profile jig is you will maintain bottom contact more often than a lighter size jig. By maintaining bottom contact more often, you will be in the strike zone much more often, and you will catch more bass compared to if you are not maintaining bottom contact as much using a lighter size jig. Some days they will want a smaller profile of a lighter jig, so it's best to experiment to see what the bass are wanting for that particular day. More often than not though, I will throw a larger profile jig so I can have that chance at potentially catching my next personal best bass. Let me know in the comment section down below what your favorite jig weight to use is during the winter time. Sometimes though, they will not want a larger size profile jig, so that's whenever I will downsize my jig. This leads me to my next mistake that I see many anglers make whenever they are fishing a jig during the winter time. The fourth mistake that I see many anglers make whenever they are fishing a jig during the winter time is being afraid to downsize their jig. Sometimes it's best to downsize your jig if you're trying to get more bites or if you're fishing a heavy pressured body of water. Whenever I downsize my jig, I will generally go with a finesse jig just because of its smaller profile. Sometimes by downsizing your jig, you can produce some good quality bites compared to if you're fishing a larger size profile jig. Don't be fooled into thinking that downsizing your jig will mean that you will get much more smaller bites, because this is further from the truth. The finesse jig can be very productive this time of year and is one of the best ways to get the bass to bite whenever the bite gets tough. My favorite jig by far is the Kitech Model 2 finesse jig. This jig does well because of its smaller profile and it's made out of tungsten too. This allows you to have more sensitivity whenever you're fishing the jig during the winter time, and it will let you feel so many more bites whenever you're using this jig. Whenever selecting a trailer for my finesse jig, I normally like to go with the Z-Man Bugs just because of how compact it is when used as a trailer on the back of my finesse jig. The Z-Man Bug stands up in the water due to its buoyancy and makes the finesse jig look very realistic in my opinion. You should experiment with different finesse jig trailers to see what works best for you and the body of water that you're fishing in. The finesse jig is an important tool to have in your tackle box whenever they're not wanting to commit to a larger size jig presentation or whenever the bite gets tough. Also, whenever you're fishing a finesse jig, it will fall through the water column much more slowly due to how light it is compared to a full-size jig presentation. Sometimes this is what the bass are wanting, but it really does depend on the mood of the bass for that day. Generally, I will not fish a finesse jig over 1/4 of an ounce, but most of the time I will go lighter, but it really does depend on the mood of the bass for that day. Make sure you comment down below if you have success using a finesse jig and what your favorite finesse jig to use is during the winter time. The fifth mistake that I see many anglers make whenever they are fishing a jig during the winter time is fishing the jig way too fast. Many anglers will fish the jig way too fast during the winter, and this will severely impact how many bass that you get to bite whenever the water temperatures drop. Like I said earlier, bass are very lethargic during the winter and the forage will slow down too. By slowing down when fishing a jig, you will better imitate the forage and you will get a lot more bites whenever you're fishing the jig during the winter time. You will also be able to pick apart a spot much more efficiently whenever you slow down, and you will be in the strike strike zone for much longer. During the wintertime, the bass will not feed as much compared to the warmer months due to their metabolism slowing down whenever the water temperature drops. This means that a bass will not chase down your jig, and why it is so important to slow down during the wintertime. I like to fish my jig as slow as possible this time of year due to how low the water temperatures are. A good helpful tip is if you think you're fishing the jig slow enough, try slowing down even more. This will better imitate the forage that the bass are feeding on. I promise you will get more bites whenever you slow down, and you will get so much more efficient fishing a jig during the wintertime. Many anglers will fish the jig way too fast, and this will severely impact how many bites that you get this time of year. I know for some anglers that this can be extremely hard fishing this slow, but this can be one of the most efficient ways to get the bass to bite whenever the bite gets tough. By slowing your jig down, you will be much more successful fishing a jig during the winter, and you will get so many more bites, and you can potentially catch your next personal best bass doing this. Make sure you comment down below how slow you like to fish your jig during the winter time. These are my top 5 mistakes that I see many anglers make whenever they are fishing a jig during the winter. By avoiding these 5 common mistakes, you will greatly increase the quality and the quantity of the bass you catch when the water temperature drops during the winter time. Let me know if this video helped you in the comment section down below. Also, let me know down below if you have confidence fishing a jig and what your favorite jig and jig trailer is to use during the winter. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button to help the video in the YouTube algorithm so more people can get recommended this video. If you are not subscribed, I would love to have you join the channel. If you want to check out another proven fish catcher during the winter time, make sure you check out this video right here on the paddle tail swim bait.